Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Sustainable Commodities podcast, a podcast to help people navigate the ever-changing world of sustainability and sustainable commodities. I'm Barnaby Patchett, MD of 199 Agency, a marketing agency working in sustainability. And with me
is Judith Murdoch from Murdoch Associates, and we specialise in forestry commodities.
Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about soya supply chains, among other things. And to help us do that, we're joined by Vivian Ribeiro, Head of Consulting and R&D at Meridia. Meridia is an AgTech company that specialises in field data solutions for commodity supply chains like cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber and soy.
Very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to join the podcast today. I've been working quite basically my entire life with the expansion and impact of the agro sector, especially on forest and savannas. I'm originally from Brazil, so it's a country that takes the agro sector quite serious, but we also face a lot of those challenges on controlling the impact and make sure that this expansion comes in a sustainable way, right? So it's going to be really nice to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, good. Yeah, well, very much welcome. Just before we really start digging into it, I was very interested in the history of Meridia. When did you start? How old are you?
This is a really good point to start, Judith, because Meridia started 10 years ago and has a really, really good story associated to understanding the challenges of the smallholders to actually acquire land titling. So it was in Ghana 10 years ago that the company was understanding how the challenges related to actually provide measurements of the farms, to actually have the farm properly mapped to support land titling. And this gives us so much information, so much knowledge on understanding how difficult it is to actually get this information, to get the coordinates done, to get proper quality and integrity on those spatial information. And now this whole EUDR discussion and the necessities of declaring the farm plots, this knowledge and this experience that we acquired for such a long time, especially with the cocoa and coffee sector, comes very handy.
You started in Ghana, and then did you just expand out from there? How did it work?
That's right. So it started in Ghana with the land titling, but then the company is actually based in Amsterdam. It's a Dutch company. And here we are very, very close to actually provide more information on the compliance and all the risks and all the assessments that are related to the places where the agricultural practices are done. So we don't only had those projects associated to land titling, but we also support other companies on getting this information right, or checking the validation, on doing the farm mapping properly assessed. And then this can support other things different than just compliance. We're also talking about development programs, for example, or whatever can support actually the companies to have a much better assessment of their chain of custody, to control their supply chain much better. So this is how the company moved from land titling to support on understanding the location of your suppliers by designing those, by mapping those farm maps, and now all the way to face the challenges of compliance with deforestation and legality.
Yeah, and definitely when you're talking about land titling and smallholders, that is a major issue for all smallholders. So what are the biggest challenges when you go to see a smallholder to map out their farm?
There are so many different challenges. I would say that the first one is the recognition of accessibility, right? Accessibility is different depending on the country, depending on what part of the country you are. When you're, for example, in the Ivory Coast or in countries like Brazil, they are gigantic. You can face different challenges. Some places it takes you so many hours to just get to a farm that can increase the difficulties of really understanding, which automatically also creates some barriers for accessibility to the market, right? But also getting this data right. So using the instruments that are accurate enough to design those polygons, to design those farm maps, or even the farm plots, which is more of the under scope of the current regulation, like the EUDR. And then you can see challenges such as overlaps or spikes, which is provoked by, for example, polygons that they do not close properly. So it goes from accessibility to all the way to the technology that you're going to use to get this information correctly.
And what technology do you use? Because as a complete layperson, never doing anything like this, I can imagine it's difficult, but exactly what equipment do you use?
I think the part of the technology on getting the GPS with the accuracy that you actually need to get to do the farm mapping properly is not as hard as actually the engagement that you need to do with the people that are being mapped, right?
Interesting.
As the company moves more towards like abandoning these old style investments in the field on farm mapping and really work more on the intelligence, we also have quite a lot of knowledge on knowing that this whole process of sensibilization, of discussing to the people that they are getting their data mapped for a purpose, it is a huge challenge as well. So nowadays that we see that regulations are demanding that, but also companies are getting more and more this information, there is this challenge beyond the technology to inform them the purpose of doing that. So it's still very common that we go to some places and we have some experience of people that do not understand why this information is being taken from them.
Does that tend to be the pushback? Is it just why? Or what's the big concerns that smallholders tend to have about, hang on, you're coming in here and mapping my data?
So there are many different reactions to that, right? I think usually the one is more the why, is more to understand what are the benefits that are associated to that. And it's so much easier when you have this level of clarity that it's not in the negative side of the spectrum, right? We're not going there and saying, I mean, good also to recognize that Meridia is now much more on the software as a service. We do much more of the remote assessment. We do still have some farm mapping, and then we do still own a lot of this knowledge, but the company is moving more towards the remote assessment, the software as a service, the compliance checks and verification. But I would say that most of the challenges now is for them to understand why we're doing that and to communicate the needs for that. And then it's always much better if you go with a positive speech, with a positive incentive, than to say, we're going to do that, otherwise you're excluded from the supply chain. This is not the intention of what the farm mapping activities promoted by companies or what the farm plot demanded by the regulation aims to achieve. So exclusion should always be, and for Meridia, it is the last resort. We don't want to exclude smallholders, but we all need to nowadays acknowledge that this regulation imposes some requirements that is naturally harder for smallholders than for big industrial concessions or farms, right? So this recognition is something that puts us in a very nice place in the market because we understand the challenges and we work to actually prevent exclusion.
That's really good. I mean, I remember at SPOD last year, Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue, the EU Commissioner using that threat of exclusion very explicitly in terms of saying, I mean, on the stage, someone asked her what were the benefits to smallholders, and she said, well, they can access the EU market. And the threat was so implied. It wasn't. It was very clear what she meant by that. So it's nice to see that you're approaching it from a more positive side.
Yeah. And do you think smallholders know what the EUDR is, or are they still unsure?
It really depends. And I would say that this is the moment when we see how healthy the supply chain is, right? When we have partners engaging with others and clarifying, and we have actually this idea that the European market can absorb production at a higher cost, and this can actually takes them to a more positive approach that they want to continue in the supply chain because it has a better prices. There is this whole concept of premiums, for example, associated to that. And then in this case, we're talking about a healthier supply chain, more conversation between different actors, and then usually we're facing smallholders that are much more informed. When you don't have this kind of thing, and this is very common for suppliers that are more positioned very far upstream, very often as indirect suppliers, they are less informed, less connected. And usually when you say EUDR, they say, UD what? And then it's quite complicated.
Yeah. And what do you think are the major challenges of traceability in general?
In general, I would say that the contamination is one of the main challenges. So the EUDR and contamination, when I say contamination, is actually the opposite of the segregation, right? So there are different ways, different models. I would say that I still did a really good job at actually bringing a little bit more structure and alignment on the nomenclature around different types of structures of chain of custody. But we know very well that the EUDR, to be fully in compliant, we need to have the segregation. You need to ensure that that product that was produced in that farm plot, that you can verify that there's no deforestation or illegality on it. This is the product that should be placed in the European market under all due diligence statements that are provided. And then the road between this plot where the commodity is produced and the market, it changes hands very often, right? And the practices are very different. And of course, the challenges will differ depending on the country, depending on the commodity. But I would say there is a big risk associated to how the supply chain is handled.
That brings us quite nicely to soya, doesn't it? If we're going to be talking about this. So how does that apply to soya?
I think soy and palm oil are really great examples of how this can get even more tricky because they are both commodities. They are very often, when they reach a facility, a logistic facility, in the case of the soy, we have silos or crushing facilities or refineries, depending on the product that we're talking about. They can mix with other sources that are not necessarily in compliance. And then we do have different strategies that we're listening everywhere. I mean, you can actually have the information about all the providers for a facility and ensure that every single grain of soy that is going to reach that silo is actually verified and it's EUDR compliant, and then you can operate much more safely. In this case for soy, one of the concepts that I truly love is the idea of this compliance corridors, that you can find areas and huge areas or supply sheds, right? Those locations that will supply to the facility that are already in compliance. They don't have, for example, overlaps with protected areas of integral protection, for example. We don't have deforestation and forest after the cutoff set by the regulation, which is the 31st of December 2020. And then you operate in a much more safe area because whatever is going to reach there, it's going to be in compliance. So I'm quite positive because also when you look at this approach, we're talking about an entire area that we're not going to see deforestation after the cutoff date. And then this boosts the capacity of the EUDR to actually promote a more sustainable future, less deforestation associated to those commodities. There's no way this commodity is just going to if this commodity is going to another market without the EUDR, China, staying inside South America, for example, it's free of deforestation. So it's a great benefit of this approach.
Yeah, I remember talking last year, I think it was at it was the RT, about the jurisdictional approach to certification for them. And I mean, it's still in its infancy, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. Is that something that it's kind of what you're suggesting with that area? It's the sort of foundations for a more jurisdictional approach. Is that something that you kind of see as the future?
I like jurisdictional approach because when we're talking about administrative areas, you're also talking about public policies. And then we're talking about public policies. We know that a very powerful instrument to control deforestation is actually the actions from the government. You do have a role of private companies, you do have a role of international commodity supply chains, but you do need to recognize that the government play a major role on controlling deforestation, right? And then when you do that and you think that there is an administration because the jurisdiction has an administration, you're much more, it's much more likely that you're gonna see a strong governance structure to prevent the deforestation happening after this cutoff date. So I like the jurisdictional approach, but at the same time, there is one requirement of the EUDR, which is the farm plot level. You can declare the entire jurisdiction. However, this is a huge declaration in excess, and you're going to put yourself at risk if there is one person, one farm that goes against what is agreed there, right? So there are the pros and cons for sure, but I like at least that the jurisdiction commit to a strategy because you call more of this international partnership. That is exactly what we all want to see coming from the EUDR. We want to see governments working together, national traceability system supporting the private sector. This is the change we want to see in supply chains.
And then when we're talking farm level, farmers don't always just grow palm oil, or soya is slightly different in terms of the vast scale it can be. Palm oil is a vast scale too, but particularly smallholders having palm oil trees, but also maybe having coconut and even obviously in certain areas, and even rubber. And then there'll be, I mean, my experience, Thailand perhaps comes to mind, where, great areas of growing fruit trees. So how does that all work out when you're trying to look at plotting the land? Do you plot the farm, or do you plot the commodity, so the palm oil boundary?
It's such a great question, really, because nowadays that we're finally seeing companies, I mean, since last year, to be honest, we've been engaging with companies. Meridia's been working together with big players in the market in the multiplicity of commodities. And we see a lot of different things, right? We see farm plots perfectly designed to represent that piece of land that is dedicated to produce the commodity. So let's talk about coffee, for example. The polygon I see is the polygon that is the perfect design of the coffee area that is producing the coffee that is going to go to the European market. This is much easier because then we don't have this different land uses. So you only have a coffee there. So it's much easier. But this is not the reality everywhere, right? So for example, Brazil, what we see more often there is that the declaration is actually the entire farm. And this happens because it wasn't a long time ago that Brazil creates an entire system called Environmental Rural Registry. We call it CAR in the Portuguese acronym. And what we have there, it was a 2012 law, the forest code in Brazil, that said that every single farm would have to have their boundaries declared, not only the boundaries of the farm, but also other features as well. Because they did this exercise not a long time ago, this information is there, and then they can use it to declare as the area where they are producing. What happens very often is, let's stay with coffee as an example, coffee properties, coffee farms, they also produce other commodities such as sugarcane. Sugarcane is not even included in the scope of the EUDR. So if you have a deforestation happening where we have sugarcane, but that entire farm was declared as a coffee area, according to the latest information that we have from the European Commission, if I'm not mistaken, it was in October last year, you are responsible for the compliance in the entire area that you are declaring, which means that the deforestation happening in the sugarcane will actually be detected in the area that you declared as a coffee area because you detected the entire farm. So this is abusing the declaration and access, which is allowed, but very often can play against you. So nowadays, what we do in Meridia is actually very often we run some extensive research to understand what is going there. And this is how we declared that the polygons that we were seeing in our platform, they were not crops only, they were the entire farm boundaries. So this represents a more risky type of declaration for sure.
Yeah. And what do you think about grasslands, the Cerrado? We talk a lot about deforestation, obviously been part of the EUDR, but the big miss is areas such as the Cerrado. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have a very special place in my heart for this area because this is where I came from. So I'm from this state in Brazil called Goiás, which is one state that is 100% placed in the heart of the Cerrado. It's one of the Cerrado is a hotspot of biodiversity. It's extremely rich, but at the same time as well, the deforestation rates are really scary, especially if you compare with other deforestation rates such as in the Amazon. If you take the amount of deforestation divided by the amount of natural vegetation that you still see there, especially the primary vegetation, the original vegetation, the deforestation in Cerrado can be 5 times more aggressive than what we see in the Amazon. And this is promoted by the expansion of the agribusiness. And this happens because we have much more pasture opening areas. We have much more soy expanding to there. Either or not, this is happening because of other efforts in other areas, such as in the Amazon, we have the soy moratorium. And since 2006, the cutoff then moved to 2008. But since those years, you don't have the areas deforestation actually the soy driving deforestation in this area. Either this is promoting more or less deforestation in the Cerrado. We have an extensive discussion in the scientific community to understand how this is connected or not. But the truth is, the deforestation rates in the Cerrado is huge. The biodiversity to be protected there in the ecosystem services in terms of the provision of water for agriculture is key in this environment. So my automatic answer to you, Judith, is to say it's time for us to take seriously the role of savannas and grasslands on controlling ecosystem services and commit to much more than just forest structure.
Yeah. The cynic in me says that it's because all of the focus is on the Amazon. I mean, you know, in my childhood at school, we were taught about, you know, the rainforest and deforestation in the Amazon, the lungs of the world, all of these things. I'd never heard of the Cerrado. So is it potentially a kind of a with my marketing head on, a sort of PR issue? Okay, well, we know they're looking at the Amazon, so we
I
won't do
think so.
anything there. But yeah, no one's heard of this.
I
outside
think
of
so.
Brazil.
I think we had a huge forest centrism happening, especially when like late 80s, early 90s, when we had started to have much more of like the international pressure to protect forests. And then we start to see also the creation of international funds to protect those areas, the recognition of the role of those phytophysiognomies, those vegetations that holding and storing carbon, and to the point that we started talking in a much more mature way about controlling the climate and the global warming, and then forests being perceived as this capacity. I mean, this whole thing about the lungs of the world, we found out that kind of like very debatable, because it's more like a climax. It holds, but it can be a bomb of carbon if deforestation continues. But this is mostly because we can see a lot of carbon stored in that vegetation that is above ground. When you look at the Cerrado, most of this carbon is underground. Those roots, they go really deep to be able to capture water. So even the role of the Cerrados and grasslands in controlling climate is understated. And this, yes, I would say that there is a huge PR, but also how I think the PR is the beginning of everything, right? But you had much more funding for research associated to forest and associated to other phytophysiognomies such as savannas and grasslands.
So going back just a little bit, we mentioned quite a bit earlier about polygon data. Now we're seeing a kind of growing reluctance to sharing this polygon data, and this is relatively new as far as I'm aware. But we're seeing it, you know, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the USA, and even Brazil, as to whether this polygon data should be shared. That's obviously got an implication when it comes to EUDR compliance.
Well, from our perspective as Meridia, this certainly makes life much harder in terms of providing the answer to the clients in terms of what is the risk assessment in your operations when you cannot really interact with it, right? Some companies, they do trust us on getting the data. So we do have high standards of data protection in Meridia to ensure that we can process this information and they are safely stored. But yeah, what you're talking is much more on the necessity of having a better trust and alignment between governments, right? So Indonesia government and the European as well organization, the Commission talking and actually clarifying that there is a need to exchange this information. There is a value of exchanging this information. I do understand how countries can be more protective of this information. At the same time, that for me, it's a bit. There is a conflict of ideas, I would say, because at the same time that we see that you do have a lot of transparent data coming from those countries, but those data are not really accessible in a more actionable way, you know, like shape files, GeoJSON. You don't get the polygon that you can actually use to process this information. So what my takeaway from this whole discussion, this whole point that we're now, is that the European Commission still have quite a lot of homework to do to enable this international understanding of the importance of the farm plot declaration, to make it happen, and to make sure that countries will not stop trading to EU, which is the type of thing that the EU doesn't want as well, right? So that I would say that's a big homework for the Commission to actually get the trust between governments. And we know that there is a lot of politics being discussed and agreements being made behind that is beyond capacity of people that are not in the middle of these discussions to understand. But I do see how this needs to be sorted as soon as possible, considering that the enforcement will come at the end of this year.
So I've got two questions. One regarding Trump, but I'll leave that for the second part of the question. So how valuable is a polygon in reality? What is the benefit? So a polygon definition that I'm aware of is, say, for football fields. How useful is that? Is it at that level?
So this takes me to some discussions we had in 2022. I think it was in 2022 or 2023. I don't remember so well, but we were discussing about like, wow, the EUDR wants the farm plots. Oh, how many companies actually have this level of traceability? So I'm gonna start with a very positive view about that, which is the maturity that grew on those companies trading commodities, especially from the global south, and understanding their supply chain and creating that relationship between more downstream partners and upstream suppliers is something amazing that will promote it will promote benefits that go much beyond just compliance with the market. It's trust, is the reliability that you can actually provide good forecasts of your production. You can manage your business so much better. You can understand development programs how they can be deployed in an effective way. So there are benefits that go much beyond the UGR, the idea that you need to interact with suppliers and get the farm plots. However, at the same time that I'm saying that, this represents a lot of work. This represents the need of those that can actually provide this technology, can provide this work, can actually have this technical capacity to go there and map. And the reason why the EUDR decided for the farm plot, this is my interpretation. Of course, the regulation doesn't really state this is the reason why we're doing that. It's because it's very black and white in the regulation. We do not want deforestation after the cutoff date, products that produced in this area to join the European market. And for me, in terms of actually answering to the wishes of the European consumers, this is the way how you can do that, because it's very black and white. In terms of value, when we talk about value in terms of conservation, and then it's again a bit debatable, right? Some people would say that it's so easy for some big players to just shift the market in a way that what is compliant goes to you, what is not compliant goes to other markets that have less standards, and therefore we're not going to see any impact in deforestation. Anyway, the EU achieved its goal, which is to not have deforestation in the products that are joining their markets. But at the same time, I don't think that people would disagree with me here saying that other markets have started to take better steps, more bold steps towards sustainability commitments as well. So right now we do see a lot of dry runs, a lot of different reports promoted between the Chinese government. I'm very biased here about Brazil because I do follow a lot the Brazilian agenda, but between the Brazilian government and the Chinese government, being China the main trade partner that Brazil has. So you do see that the governments beyond the EU, they are doing their steps to actually follow the same direction. And I think this is another very positive side collateral effect of the EUDR. So I would say that it is painful. It does take quite a lot of resources. It has its risk, and the risks can be really, really bad, such as the exclusion of the smallholders, why we actually need to go in the opposite direction. But I think the benefits are so much far beyond the UDR in terms of strong, reliable supply chains with much less disruptions.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then my second part of the question was
Trump.
Trump, only because I'm trying not to bring him too much into the conversation because I think he's got enough airtime. But the disruption, so as we record this, it's right in the height of the disruption of the tariffs. He's just announced a 90-day, delay. Thank you. But my point is America could be regarded as a low-risk country. And if, particularly on timber and paper products, they won't give geolocations, and also soy, to be fair, and soy. if they were just regarded as a low-risk country and then didn't have to give the polygon data, is that fair just to brand them as say, like in the Netherlands themselves would be a low-risk country? Or if the EU goes on to force it, would it actually undermine what's going to happen? So it's just it's a bit of a personal question to you. What's your view on that?
Well, I can also give you a personal answer, which is my interpretation of the scenario, right? So I'm going to start from the end of your question, which is the probability that this is going to undermine the implementation of the regulation. And I think it's huge. I mean, we saw everything. We saw what happened last year when we had all these amendments being proposed. And I'm actually extremely proud that the only thing that we saw there was a postponement of 1 year. We didn't really see anything like the regulation getting weaker, because this signal is much more beyond just the commitment, right? It's the respect towards the legislative process. So I don't want to see this coming, really. I think this is going to create such a huge damage, not only in the regulation, but also how much the European people will trust what is being proposed. So I think this needs to be taken so seriously. So I don't think we're going to see that, and I really don't want to see something like that coming. Also because otherwise we're really talking about neocolonialism 2.0, which is something that we discussed so much during this whole trialogue that we saw at the end of last year, right? We want the countries to be actually treated following the same standards, right? We're all very curious to see what's going to be the country benchmark and how countries will be shaped as high, medium, or low. But beyond this country benchmark, I just want to highlight one thing that very often we forget to talk about, that the high risk countries here, they can be actually interpreted as subregions, which means that countries such as Indonesia, Brazil, big countries, they can be interpreted according to their subregions. And I think this is such a great direction to go towards, because then you don't frame a country as a high, medium, or low risk, which I think from a diplomatic perspective, is such a risky thing. It's such a bad way of doing business.
Yeah.
You just put a tag and you assign a label to a country that the country is a high risk. I see no purpose for that. So my expectation is to see a country benchmark that takes into consideration the sub-regions where we do have a high risk, but in other areas where we actually have low risk. So I'm expecting countries like Indonesia, Brazil, other countries in Africa such as the Ivory Coast or Ghana to be treated as sub-regions much more than the entire country. That wouldn't do any good, really. And in terms of United States is another one of these huge countries that I think should also be perceived as in sub-regions. We do have high rates of deforestation happening in United States as well, but in some sub-regions, and because of like the whole attention that we go back to the point that Barnaby made before, like the whole PR thing, the eyes are so much more towards the tropical forests. We still need to recognize that there are areas in the United States that the interpretation would be automatically a high risk. So yeah, I'm very curious to actually see sub-regions much more than the countries being tagged.
Yeah.
So, I mean, let's expand on this a bit more. The nice juicy stuff around Trump, isn't there just a risk that for a man whose motto last year was drill, baby, drill, that it could be that he just put so much leverage on the EU and a potential trade deal with tariffs that the EU ultimately is simply forced to drop EUDR?
I really doubt. I really doubt that, because again, we're talking about not trusting the legislations here, right? So the damage in how much reliable all the legislative structure of the bloc would look like internationally would be a really big damage internally in the bloc. So I really doubt this is gonna happen. I do see the pressure coming. I don't see United States fighting that hard based on the EUDR. I think there are other regulations that are more the target for the country, for US, much more than the EUDR, even though the soy export is significant coming from United States to Europe. But I do see this type of influence going towards much more older regulations, especially those when we're talking about industrialized goods, than really on the EUDR. So I'm not, maybe I'm too naive, but I'm not super concerned about you using the leverage on the discussions about the tariffs to actually undermine the implementation of the EUDR. I don't see how the EU would actually consider the cost benefit as being attractive. But I do see that this is a possibility in upcoming regulations, much more often than this one that we're just waiting to be enforced, but is already in place.
Yeah. It's really a fascinating place to be, and definitely you must be excited to work in such a company doing such great things. I guess the bit for me is, where do you see your future after EUDR, or do you just see the business expanding into just it being commonplace to be able to trace your vast amount of different crops, not just the 7 named in EUDR? What do you see for the future?
So this is what Meridia is already studying, right? So I'm in this very privileged position to work in a company that knows so much about the challenges that our clients are facing. We learn so much from our previous experience, from our current experience with the projects that we still have, field projects that we still have, from the clients that use Meridia Verify to verify their compliance with regulations such as the EUDR. But the privileged position that I have is because I'm the head of the consulting in R&D, and R&D is a very exciting place to be in a company, right? So nowadays we've been discussing so much and trying to understand the voluntary standards, that the voluntary sustainability standards that the companies are adding to the roadmap. I was doing some, just playing a little bit with the power of AI nowadays. It's fascinating to all of us to really see how much we can get information processed very quickly. I was looking at the top 10 grain traders and trying to see how much alignment we see in this sustainability roadmap, to see they are aligned towards addressing the same risks, right? So the DCF, the conversion free, going beyond forest, but also regenerative agriculture, and a lot of commitments, voluntary commitments being made, much more than just for the commodities that are mentioned in the EUDR. So we do have quite a lot of products, experience, and capacity to actually to provide a solution for the companies on their roadmaps. So I would say that there is no random commitment being made in the industry. The industry knows very much what is the impact that is created because of what is material to them. They are very well aligned because, lots of different actors also play a role, such as the civil society, in making sure that those impacts are acknowledged and included in the sustainability roadmap. So things like regenerative agriculture, scope 3 emissions, size-basic targets, the DCF, all those things being mentioned in the sustainability report are very well aligned. The human rights violation, which will very soon be one regulation in EU with the FLR, the forced labor regulation. Those things are the ones that we're now studying solutions and already piloting actually solutions with some clients to be able to just expand Meridia Verify towards much more. I would say what we say here, beyond the EUDR. There's a lot of solutions to be provided. So the consulting part of Meridia is really to provide those services that will lead to product expansion, because we really want to know and to learn and to get it right. What is the solution that we need to put it there in a very cost-effective way? And this is the benefit of running a very competent SaaS product that can deliver the solution, can support achieving and verifying the claims. Because I think one of the things that the companies they appreciate is that their claims can be verified in a cost-effective way, so they can actually continue to commit to that and continue to monitor that in a very nice way. And this is why Meridia is here to support the clients.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I see. I guess you see more and more kind of NGOs and sort of activist journalists are looking for this kind of. They're looking for non-compliance. They're looking for greenwashing. They're looking for claims that aren't true or that have been exaggerated. And in terms of having that verifiable data, is the company's best defense against those.
I do have, big part of my career is actually in the civil society. So I started my career in an organization in Brazil, studying the deforestation and engaging with deforestation and conversion in the Cerrado, and trying as hard as possible to expand the soil moratorium beyond the Amazon. And they do that, and they do that as a way as actually to provide the truth, right? To be able to go there and engage with what they can do from the support of external funding. Of course, there's a risk there in terms of loss of perspective, I would say, or getting a little bit too much in the weeds that takes a little bit too long to produce reports or results, or being non-representative of the entire operation. But we are counting very much, and when I say we, I don't say that as part of a company, I say that as part of society. The civil society is there to protect the society, to understand what is the public benefit, and that those process of producing and the agribusiness that generates so much of the GDP of so many countries, they don't go at the expense of the water provision, the safety, the respect to the local communities and the indigenous population. So even the EUDR is very bold at saying that the substantiated concerns will be taken and will be actually appointed to the competent authorities and will be investigated. And this is the role of the civil society in my perspective when we talk about the EUDR, is to make sure that the solution providers or the companies are taking those purifications process very seriously and are doing that properly, not only just claiming that everything is fine and crossing their fingers that the competent authorities were not going to see anything. So yeah, that's why Meridia, now I say as Meridia much more than just than part of the society, is that we do engage with the civil society very often to calibrate our methodology, to understand that what we see from our perspective, from our lens, is what they see when they engage with other stakeholders. Just as I gave examples of the stakeholders, like the local communities of indigenous populations as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Vivian. Yeah, it's been a fantastic conversation. I think that's probably a good place to end it. But yeah, thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone for listening to the Sustainable Commodities podcast.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.